Today, we'll be talking about drugs and consciousness. So, a couple of different classification for drugs. We have psychoactive drugs, right? These are a chemical substance that alters perceptions and moods. With these drugs, we tend to get physical dependence and psychological dependence. So, a physical dependence is a physiological need for the drug. So, this is where your body is craving the drug. And this is marked by unpleasant withdrawal symptoms. So, different drugs are different. Some drugs, if you stop taking it, you have really bad withdrawal symptoms. And this could be, and when we talk about drugs, we're talking about legal and illegal drugs. Because, like, caffeine's a legal drug, but people who drink coffee all the time and then don't have coffee that day, they have really bad withdrawal symptoms like headaches from not having the caffeine. And then there's also psychological dependence. This is a psychological need to use a drug. For example, to relieve negative emotions. So you see this a lot. I see this with people who smoke cigarettes, right? Nicotine's a drug that's in cigarettes. And they're like, oh, like maybe they're stressed or something like that. And they're like, oh, I just need a cigarette, right? So it's that psychological dependence that they have on drugs. And you see this all the time. Well, a reason why a lot of people get addicted to like illegal drugs too is because that psychological dependence on it. They need it to deal with certain emotions, and then they develop that physical dependence on it. So dependence and addiction, tolerance. All right, tolerance is a vocab word you should know, and so is withdrawal. So tolerance is the diminishing effect with regular use. So the body begins to stop producing these chemicals naturally. So what this is saying, if you build a tolerance for a drug, you need more and more of that drug to get the same effect. And this is why people get addicted to drugs because especially like painkillers because your body starts producing it naturally. So then to get that same effect to help with the pain, you need to take two, three, four times as much as you originally did, and then you become addicted to it. Same thing with like cocaine and stuff like that. Your body stops producing those neurotransmitters naturally, and then you need more and more of that drug to get that same effect. So sometimes they say like it's never as good as the first time you do it because you build up a tolerance for that drug. Withdrawal is, like we just talked about, is that discomfort and distress that follow discontinued use. So you can see on this chart, so this side right here is the effect. So the higher up is the more effect you have on the drug. So the first time you take the drug, small dosage, you get a big effect. But then after you take the drug more and more times, you have to see how the dosage increases, right? To get that same effect, right? Look how much more of the drug you have to take to get that same effect. That is building up a tolerance for the drug. So what are some different types of psychoactive drugs? We have depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens. So depressant is drugs that reduce neural activity, right? So this slows the body functions down. Some examples of depressants, and make sure you know the different types of drugs and what they are. Alcohol, barbiturates, which are like tranquilizers, and opiates. These are all examples of depressants. You have stimulants. These are drugs that excite the neural activity. They speed up the body functions. So like caffeine, nicotine, amphetamine, so like meth and stuff like that, and cocaine. If anyone's ever seen the movie, is it Crash? No, it's called Crank, right? So in that movie, Jason Statham, the actor, he got injected with this drug and he has to keep his heart pounding. And so one of the things he does numerous things to do that. One of the things he does is actually to take cocaine. And then lastly, we have hallucinogens. These are psychedelic, which are like mind manifesting drugs that distort perceptions and evoke sensory images in the absence of sensory input. So, right, the most powerful hallucinogen is LSD, right? Sometimes called acid. So, effects of drugs. Research tells us that the effects of drugs depend not just on its biological effects, but also on the psychology of the user's expectations. So if one culture assumes that a particular drug produces euphoria and another does not, each culture may find its expectations fulfilled. So an example of this could be like marijuana, right? Marijuana seems to be a good example of this and is currently at the center of national debates as its value or danger of it. So cultures have been smoking, weed for centuries. And it all depends on how you looked at it. Now if you look at it as getting you high and certain things, you're going to act that way. Like if you think everything's funny, or all of a sudden you want to eat everything in your house. Versus other cultures see it, so like Native Americans, it was kind of mixed in with tobacco and different herbs, and they did it and they looked differently. They weren't laughing at their tribal meetings and where they did it. So it depends on your culture and how you look at it. So if you look at it just for a medicinal purpose, then you're going to act that way, right? So a lot of times you act the way you think you're supposed to act, or different cultures use it different. Kind of like the placebo effect in the alcohol, like I talked about at the beginning here, how some people act drunk because they think they're drinking alcohol when they're really not drinking alcohol at all. So psychoactive drugs. So with depressants, so barbiturates, these are drugs that depress the activity of the central nervous system, reducing anxiety. But the side effect is it impairs your memory and your judgment. So these are, like I said earlier, like tranquilizers. So they reduce your anxiety, but yet because of that, maybe you don't remember exactly what's going on and you have poor judgment. Opiates. This is like opium and all of its derivatives. So like morphine and heroin. Opiates depress neural activity, temporarily lessening pain and anxiety. So like morphine's an extremely strong um, painkiller. Like you might get it in the hospital if you have like a major surgery or something like that, but it's very addictive. Right? It's very addictive. And so, I mean, I've even heard a story of like Vietnam where soldiers were getting addicted to morphine, so they tried to give them heroin to get them off morphine. Now, obviously, that did not work. Heroin is known as one of the most addictive drugs that you can get. So stimulants, amphetamines is a stimulant, right? Drugs that stimulate neural activity, causing speeded up body functions and associated with energy and mood changes, results in short-term energy and euphoria, eventually reduces baseline dopamine level, leaving user permanently depressed. So an example of an amphetamine would be like cocaine or meth. So here is the cocaine euphoria and the crash, so how it works. So these might look familiar when we talked about like neurotransmitters early in the year. So first thing that happens is neurotransmitters carry a message from a sending neuron across the synapse, remember that's the gap in between the two, to receptor sites on a receiving neuron. So you can see how these are receiving the neurons that are being sent, remember, in the vesicles carrying the neurotransmitters, they're being crossed. Well, not all of the neurotransmitters get accepted in this neuron, so some go back up into the neuron that sent it. That's called reuptake. All right, so the sending neuron reabsorbs the excess neurotransmitter molecules, a process called reuptake. Well, how cocaine works, if you see in C here, by binding to the sites that normally reabsorb neurotransmitters, cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin. The extra neurotransmitters therefore remain in the synapse, intensifying their normal blood. So here, cocaine, it blocks the reuptake. So remember we talked about how some drugs can block? That's what it does. And so you got cocaine, some are absorbed here, the next neuron, but the ones that would be reabsorbed can't because they're being blocked, and they stay in the synapse, intensifying that feeling of euphoria. And that's how you get addicted, is because then if you keep doing that, your body stops producing those neurotransmitters. You need more and more of that drug to get that same feeling. So hallucinogens, ecstasy is a synthetic stimulant and mild hallucinogen, both short-term and long-term health risks to this. So you might hear it called different things. It's MDMA, Molly is, I think it's a form of it. So this is one where you kind of dehydrate, so you have to drink a lot of water, and it intensifies your sense of like touch and things like that. So a lot of times people who might be on ecstasy might always want to touch things because their sense of touch is heightened. LSD is a very powerful hallucinogen, also called acid. And then we have THC, and this is the major active ingredient in marijuana. It triggers a variety of effects, including a mild hallucinogen. So marijuana is actually known as a mild hallucinogen. Now, obviously, nowadays, the THC levels are extremely high in most marijuana, and varies. You can buy all different types, especially now that it's legal in a lot of states. Very different than, what you think of maybe in like the 60s when you think about the hippies and what they had. Very, very different product nowadays. So here's a nice little chart I would look at and refer to when you need to. It gives a different type of drug, and then the type of drug, the pleasurable effects, so like why you would take it, and then the adverse effects, so the side effects of it. So like we have alcohol is a depressant, the initial high followed by relaxation and disinhibition. So a lot of times people think alcohol is a stimulant because people do a lot of crazy things when they're drunk. That is not true. It's actually a depressant. So if you're depressed, it's actually very bad to start drinking alcohol, right? You become more depressed. But it lowers your inhibition, so that's why you tend to do dumb things. So the adverse effects leads to depression, memory loss, organ damage, and impaired reactions. That's why you can't drink and drive. You drink too much. A lot of people die from drinking too much because it damages their organs. And a lot of times you don't remember what you're doing when you're drinking. Heroin is a depressant. You get this rush of euphoria, relief from pain. Adverse effects, depressed physiology, agonizing withdrawal. It's supposed to be one of the worst withdrawals. The only drug that I know of that you can actually die if you stop taking it is alcohol. And these are people who are severe alcoholics. There are some cases where their body shuts down because it's so dependent on the alcohol they can die if they stop drinking. Next one is caffeine. Is a stimulant, increased alertness and wakefulness. That's why people drink it in their coffee all the time. Adverse effects: anxiety, restlessness, and insomnia in high doses. Uncomfortable withdrawals. I don't drink coffee personally. Most people, adults, do because of it helps with their alertness. But I see the withdrawals from it and how they become so addicted to it and how they act when they don't have it. And it doesn't taste very good. So why start something that doesn't taste good and has adverse effects to it? Methamphetamine, so we're talking about like speed and ice. This is a stimulant. Pleasurable effects: euphoria, alertness, energy. Adverse effects: irritability, insomnia, hypertension, and seizures. Cocaine is a stimulant. You get a rush of euphoria with it, confidence, energy. So you feel like you can do anything. And that's why a lot of times people might not just die from overdoses from the drug, which does happen, but a lot of times they might get in accidents because they get this sense of confidence they can do anything. And so a lot of times they might jump off buildings or drive extremely fast in cars and things like that. Adverse effects: cardiovascular stress because there's so much pressure on your heart. Suspiciousness, depressive crash. So afterwards you have a bad crash after getting off this, and that's why they want to keep doing it. And they say that it's never as good as the first time for a lot of these drugs. Nicotine is a stimulant, arousal and relaxation, sense of well-being. Some adverse effects: heart disease, and then cancer from smoking it, and also with the chew and stuff like that, like mouth cancer, throat cancer. It's very bad. Ecstasy, the MDMA, it's a stimulant, also known as a mild hallucinogen. You get emotional elevation and disinhibition. Adverse effects: dehydration, you can die. So if you have to make sure you're drinking water, because you can die from the dehydration and overheating that comes with it. A lot of times you get depressed mood and cognitive functioning. So some of these drugs like LSD and ecstasy, your brain can permanently be messed up from one bad trip if you have adverse effects to it. So yes, people want to do it for the high, but they do have a lot of scary effects if things go wrong. And then lastly, we have marijuana, mild hallucinogen, enhanced sensation, relief of pain, distortion of time, relaxation. So a lot of times, like maybe you think like everything's moving extremely slow with it, but it does tend to relax people. So there's a lot of positive effects with it. Once again, depends on how often you're using it and how you're using it. Adverse effects: disrupted memory, lung damage if you're smoking it, and we know now even like with the vaping and stuff like that, we found that to be extremely dangerous as well. And a lot of times people are doing it, it could be laced with something, and that's where you're getting sick from, and you don't even know it. So here's just some trends in drug use. So we see from the 70s to the 90s, alcohol started to drop in the 90s. Marijuana dropped a little bit, then it came back up in the 90s. Cocaine, a little increase in the 80s, but overall has been pretty low when we talk about high schoolers. So alcohol use, you see it start to drop. One of the reasons is it used to be legal in a lot of states to drink when you're 18. They changed that over. I know Wisconsin was one of the last states to change that over in the early 80s, like around 84. So I have an aunt that was grandfathered in to that, where she could actually drink when she was 18, even though they had changed the law. Marijuana goes up and down. Cocaine, you see a little bump in the 80s. Reminds me of like the, Wall Street, things like that was popular at that time, so it became popular. And those drugs are more popular, I guess, at affluent high schools would have that. And notice you see a big drop like the late 80s and 90s with a lot of things. What do you think was going on during this time? So they started the DARE program, drug, alcohol, and resistance education. So a lot of it has to do with education, and people realize how bad it was, and so the usage actually went down for a little bit. So here we see the green is the perceived risk. So you have a perception that marijuana is bad for you, and then the blue is the usage. So if you look at, as the years go on, once again, you get education with the DARE program, people start perceiving as, hey, marijuana might not be good for me. Well, if you think something's not good for you, then the usage tends to go down a little bit, right? Not as much as the perceived risk, but, some people are going to do it even though they know it's bad for you. And so lastly, we have, what are some of the trends today? So this is with ninth graders. So we're talking about 14, 15-year-olds. How has it been over the last few decades? So the green up top is ever drink alcohol. Notice how that has decreased a lot. So people not drinking as much now. Ever tried a cigarette? Notice that has gone down. And I've showed you this chart earlier in the year when we talked about adolescence as well. So those people aren't smoking as well. That could be because they're more expensive, or maybe just the education realize how bad they are for us. The yellow is watch television more than 3 hours a day. That used to be a major problem. Like when I was growing up, like in the 90s as a kid, they said, oh, that's going to be a major problem. Kids are just watching too much TV. That's gone down now as well. People don't watch TV as much because they're always on the computer. Ever had sexual intercourse? That's actually starting to go down, and I talked about that during adolescence because so much is screen time. There's not as much actual in-person activity going on as there once was. And then if you notice use of marijuana, that had peaked in the late 90s and has gone down a little bit and started to rise about a decade ago and started to decrease again. And that one will be interesting to see just where it will be now that it's legal. But remember, it's not legal for high school students. So, right, I think you have to be at least 21 to get it. And the last one, the purple, is just play the video game or use computers. Notice how that has gone up since they started keeping track of it in 2003, because that is what's kind of taken over a lot of other aspects. Is people, they're online doing stuff now, whatever it might be, whether it's social media, YouTube, whatever. All right.